But first then, just prior to Donald Trump's return to the White House, Volodymyr Zelensky had expressed optimism that the now U.S. president could broker peace with Russia. Well, just a month into Trump's presidency, the Ukrainian president, his tone, is now much different. Zelensky insisting that Donald Trump helped bring Vladimir Putin out of isolation. He was also forced to specify that Ukraine will not sell his country in any deal with Washington through giving access to its critical resources, a plan that Donald Trump has indeed floated in recent days. Here's the Ukrainian president.
We have seen this disinformation. We understand that it comes from Russia. We understand that. And we have evidence that these numbers are being discussed between America and Russia. So unfortunately, President Trump, who we have great respect for as the leader of the American people, whom we respect very much, who supports us constantly, unfortunately lives in this disinformation space.
Well, to Zelensky's point, then, the Kremlin swiftly hailed Donald Trump's remarks, the Russian foreign minister describing Trump as the only Western leader who has publicly and loudly said that one of the root causes of the war in Ukraine was the previous administration's efforts to bring Kyiv into NATO. On Tuesday, Donald Trump essentially blamed Zelensky for the duration of the war, claiming, I quote, he could have made a deal long ago. So Delano D'Souza with the details.
Locking horns with Ukraine's president from a distance in Mar-a-Lago. Donald Trump took a swipe at Volodymyr Zelensky after Kyiv's vocal disapproval for being left out of talks between the U.S. and Russia aimed at ending the war in Ukraine.
And I'm very disappointed. I hear that, they're upset about not having a seat. Well, they've had a seat for 3 years and a long time before that. This could have been settled very easily. Just a half-baked negotiator could have settled this years ago.
Trump says he's confident Moscow wants to do something to end the war, as he reiterated a Kremlin allegation that falsely questions Zelensky's legitimacy.
A situation where we haven't had elections in Ukraine, where we have martial law, or essentially martial law in Ukraine, where the leader in Ukraine, I hate to say it, but he's down at 4% approval rating. That's not a Russia thing. That's something coming from me.
The U.S. president's latest false statement came hours after the first talks in years between American and Russian officials. The negotiations in Riyadh were described as positive by both sides. Trump reportedly wants to have a deal with Russia wrapped up quickly and could even meet the country's president by the end of this month, a statement that's now been confirmed by the Kremlin.
Well, for more on this, then, France 24 senior international affairs editor Rob Parson joins me now on set. Hi, Rob. So what do you think, then, about this back and forth, and most notably about Volodymyr Zelensky's handling of those remarks from Donald Trump?
Well, look, Volodymyr Zelensky obviously had a pretty good idea of what was coming from Donald Trump. But I think even still, he's taken aback by just how fast things are moving and shocked by the exclusion of Ukraine and Europe from the discussions and the negotiations that took place in Riyadh on Tuesday. Whether he's right to be shocked or not, it's not the issue. Europe and Ukraine have been kept out of the loop and still appear to be kept out of the loop. So he is sort of trying to play catch up and trying to find where Ukraine's place is going to be in this. And he's trying to do so on the one hand, presenting Ukraine's case and making sure it's up there at the front, and two, trying not to offend Donald Trump, because he knows that Donald Trump is extremely touchy and that can quite easily go off in a direction that Ukraine won't be happy with if he takes offense. So it's a terribly difficult balancing act that he's got to play. And we saw just how difficult from that press conference that Donald Trump gave on Tuesday, talking about Ukraine and why Ukraine should be surprised that it wasn't represented at that meeting in Riyadh, saying, you could have made a deal. To the complete confusion of virtually everybody. Where was Ukraine meant to have made a deal? With whom? With the Russians who were invading them? Were the Russians prepared to make a deal, and on what possible terms? And when he said that, Zelensky only had popularity rating of 4%. Where did he get the information? Where did it come from? So the complete shock on the Ukrainian side, but trying to think, how can we work our way back into the game without losing Donald Trump on this? And perhaps there's a chance with Keith Kellogg, the special envoy in Kiev today, to talk to him on the ground, to acquaint him with the realities of what's happening in the Ukraine, and make it clear that Ukraine genuinely is not prepared to accept any deal that is struck without its involvement. That is the bottom line. Now, it's the bottom line for the European Union too. To a lesser extent, is playing the same game, if you want to call it that, as Ukraine. You're trying to keep it in the game, but at the same time, try to work out how to do it without offending the man in Washington.
Indeed, Rob Parsons, thank you very much. Well, meanwhile, the war, of course, continues. Russia unleashed a barrage of drone strikes on energy infrastructure in the southern Ukrainian port city of Odessa. 4 people were injured and at least 160,000 left without heat or electricity in sub-zero temperatures, according to Volodymyr Zelensky. Take a listen to reactions from residents.
The facade is very badly damaged. There's not a single window intact, and last night, when it was possible to be there and look, all the doors were gone too. Not a single door survived, so unfortunately serious damage both outside and inside the building.
It all happened around 10:30 p.m. Everybody ran to the hall of the building. All the windows were blown out. The next strike scattered all the debris around. The furniture fell, the door was blown out as well. Even the ventilation in the bathroom was knocked down. And they say that the bathroom is a safe place. Well, no, it's not.
Putin cannot be given any deals. We have to stand our ground and expel this asshole out of here.
Well, few thought the war would last this long, but in just a few days, it will have been 3 years since the beginning of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. The war of attrition has undeniably taken a heavy toll on both sides, but the situation today looks much different than it did 2 years ago, for example, when Washington-led Western support for Kyiv still seemed unshakable. Well, as the Trump administration pursues a peace plan with Russia in the Middle East, an end to the war on Ukraine's terms seems further off than ever. Well, Andrey Kurkov joins me now on the program. He's one of Ukraine's best-known writers. Last year, he published Our Daily War, a second volume of his war diaries documenting the daily realities of life under the Russian offensive, and it was just published in France as well. Andrey, thank you for joining us today. I want to start, if you will, on the artistic side of things. You are first and foremost a novelist, amongst Ukraine's most prolific, of course, but since the start of the full-scale invasion, you've been writing chronicles of daily life under the war. Why pivot to nonfiction, this almost journalistic style writing, instead of exploring it through fiction?
Well, first of all, actually, there was a lack of knowledge about the situation in Ukraine from the beginning of full-scale invasion. And I started commenting on the events and explaining in articles and essays for international media about what was happening then. And the same was done by many writers. Actually, frankly speaking, you cannot write fiction in the time when your houses and your cities are shelled with missiles and drones. For fiction, you need concentration. You need to be relaxed, to use your imagination. And when you have so many tragic real stories around you, you don't have an idea to invent another story or to work one story into a fiction.
Now, you've, of course, stayed in Ukraine throughout. In February of 2023, you wrote, like a disease, war takes control of your behavior, your thoughts, even your feelings. War starts to think for you. It makes decisions for you. I quote, that was 2 years ago. How do you think this disease of war, as you describe it, has changed the way that you and Ukrainians at large think and make decisions today in 2025?
Well, everything is the same, maybe even worse, because actually we all now different people. I changed a lot. I mean, I lost, for example, feeling of value of material items, world of property. I have a feeling that my house and my apartment do not belong to me anymore. They belong to the war, and it will be war who decides whether they will be damaged, destroyed, or they will remain intact. You don't sleep if you live in a big city, because every night you have several bomb alerts, and every time you go to check what is the reason for these alerts. If it is drones, you go to the corridor. If it is missiles, ballistic or cruise missiles, you probably go to the shelter or to the metro station if you have a metro nearby. So, I mean, logistics is different. Every travel for me from any town, any city in Europe from Kiev lasts 2 days because we don't have aviation for 3 years now. So every small detail of the life is now different than before 24th of February 2022.
Andrey, culture has, of course, been a constant theme in this war. You also cover this in your war diaries, writing in Our Daily War that Pushkinists has become a pejorative term for defenders of Russian culture in Ukraine. Has the war completely obliterated any cultural exchange between Russians and Ukrainians? And if so, do you see this as a positive development?
It's an unavoidable development, actually. There was no cultural contact practically between Russia and Ukraine from 2014, from the beginning of the war, because actually the war started with the annexation of Crimea, with the occupation of part of Donbass. And this was actually the crucial moment. And now Ukrainians hate everything Russian. I mean, there are Ukrainians who are indifferent, but generally, I don't believe anybody is interested now to find out what are Russian writers writing or what the music is composed by Russian composers. And actually Ukrainian refugees, who are 7 million in the world, they get upset every time they see posters of Tchaikovsky's ballet performed in one theater or a choir of Don Cossacks performing in another place. So, I mean, like the culture is, Russian culture became the instrument of the war. And actually, portraits of Pushkin, of Tolstoy, and Dostoevsky were used in anti-Ukrainian propaganda. And the fences around destroyed Mariupol theater were decorated with the quotations and portraits of classical Russian writers. So it will take probably one generation at least before Ukrainians can just look without indignation, without anger at these portraits.
You touched upon this earlier, but I want to know how you think the war in Ukraine has affected Ukraine's cultural space. Has there been a proliferation of work, not only from writers? You talked earlier, of course, about how difficult it is for fiction writers to do that in the middle of a war. But what about other artists? Do you think that the war has caused somewhat of a creative drought?
Well, I mean, we have a huge void because of the war. We have more than 1,000 representatives of Ukrainian culture killed on the front lines or by bombs. More than 100 poets and writers are killed. One was executed, actually, by Russians near Kharkiv, Volodymyr Vakulenko, who wrote for children. So, in fact, actually, we will have a gap in the history of Ukrainian culture. Definitely 3 years long, but maybe much longer.
It's been, of course, nearly 3 years, as I mentioned earlier, since the start of the full-scale war. Do you see a sense of generalized war fatigue? How is this affecting the morale of soldiers and even the morale of civilians as well?
Well, I think people are more traumatized than tired. They are irritated. Sometimes they are irritated by Ukrainian politicians who say something not very reasonable. Now they are irritated by Trump's statements and by the expectations of this deal that is imposed on Ukraine by Russia and America, who seems to be together now. But of course, I mean, everybody wants the war to stop, but majority of Ukrainians don't want to accept the terms of Putin. And he wants capitulation of Ukraine. He wants more of Ukrainian territory, which is still under control of Ukrainian government. He wants lots of things which are unacceptable for Ukraine.
In reading your chronicles about the war and your views on what sets Russians and Ukrainians apart, I get the impression that Ukraine remains extremely unified, largely pro-democracy, attached to political freedoms, open to deepening ties with a liberal West. But as this war does drag on, have you seen any major societal or political divisions grow amongst Ukrainians themselves?
I wouldn't say there are divisions. I mean, we have just 3 Ukraines now. We have Ukraine of refugees abroad, 7 million. We have Ukraine of displaced people who are also not very happy because they have to integrate into new traditions, new regions of Ukraine. Sometimes they are at odds with local people. They don't know what will happen to them in the future. And we have Ukrainians who are still living in their apartments and houses, like myself, who are much more, I would say, openly patriotic and who hope that Ukraine will defend its sovereignty, its independence. So I mean, there are no divisions, and there are no political divisions, because actually there is almost no political activity in the time of the war. We know that we cannot have elections when you have 7 million voters abroad, 6 million living not where they are registered, and 1 million of soldiers and officers on the front line. I mean, the soldiers are actually more adamant about the situation than the civilians who live far away from the front line. And the soldiers and officers, I mean, they're commenting on YouTube, in Telegram channels, that they don't believe there will be any deal and that they are ready to fight on.
We're going to come back to you very shortly in just a couple of minutes, Andrey. But before we do, I want to stay on this theme of divisions, because the war in Ukraine has undeniably created some widening fractures among EU nations, as you'll see in this report by Emerald Maxwell.
It's the second emergency meeting this week, convened by the French president on Ukraine, after he hosted key European leaders on Monday. This time, NATO members Norway and Canada have been invited, as well as European Union countries like Romania and the Baltic states, some of whom share borders with Russia or Ukraine. On Monday, Emmanuel Macron appeared open, along with Britain, to the idea of sending forces to Ukraine, but only in the most limited fashion and away from conflict zones.
France is not preparing to send ground troops as belligerents in a conflict to the front line. We're all concerned that a simple ceasefire in Ukraine would not resolve the conflict in any way. What will resolve it is full and complete peace with security, economic and political conditions for Ukraine over the long term.
In other words, to establish precise conditions for a possible ceasefire in Ukraine, defining, for instance, whether military experts or a UN-led peacekeeping mission should be sent in. And for this, Emmanuel Macron, like Britain, is counting on the backing of the United States.
I'm prepared to consider committing British forces on the ground alongside others if there is a lasting peace agreement. But there must be a US backstop, because a US security guarantee is the only way to effectively deter Russia from attacking Ukraine again.
European leaders are wary of showing a united front after being blindsided by the lightning rapprochement between Washington and Moscow, whose foreign ministers held their first face-to-face meeting on Tuesday since before Russia's February 2022 invasion.
We'll turn back to you now, Andrey Kurkov. If you just heard that report there, I want to know what you make of this, the inability of the European Union to really come out with a unified stance. What are the consequences on this conflict for Ukrainians?
Well, it's a very difficult situation because, of course, I mean, if America is out, and Europe was already split. European Union was split, and there were countries which were against continuation of the military help to Ukraine. I mean, Hungary was never helping Ukraine and was criticizing Ukraine. Slovakia, after the change of government, became more pro-Russian than before. The Greek communists are blocking the roads when there are trucks with ammunition for Ukraine leaving the factories. So, I mean, it's a very difficult situation, but I hope that now European Union understands that they should develop a new common strategy. They should understand how to survive without looking at US and thinking about US influence on the world situation.
Once the war is over, Andrey, I want to know how you think Ukraine might fit into the larger shift that we're seeing happening not only across the Atlantic, but also in Europe. The far right is gaining in popularity from the U.S., Hungary, Italy, Austria, Germany, here in France as well. You mentioned kind of anti-Ukrainian policies, so to speak, from three nations as well in your response. If Kyiv is to get closer to Europe, which Europe do you think that a post-war Ukraine is likely to align with?
Well, actually, I mean, Ukraine and the war in Ukraine reminded Europe the value of democracy. Because before that, for European Union, profits from China, from Russia were more important than democratical principles. And actually, Angela Merkel was signing new contracts with Putin already after annexation of Crimea and after the beginning of the war in Donbass. So I hope that Ukraine, after the war, can be a good contribution in the sense that Ukraine will promote and will remind again the values of human rights, of democracy, of rule of law. Ukraine needs also help from the European Union in order to reform itself and to become an equal, not in economical way, but actually in moral way, in political way. But I think actually Ukraine will win definitely from membership in the European Union, and European Union will find it useful to have Ukraine on its side inside the European structure.
Last November, Andrey, you wrote in the New York Times that Ukraine was running out of optimists following the election of Donald Trump. And of course, what was at the time mostly speculation about his plan to privilege Vladimir Putin's terms for ending the war. Now that we've seen this confirmed, we've also seen Donald Trump float some pretty surprising proposals to end the war in Ukraine, including Ukraine giving up to 50% of revenues from some of its most critical resources. Are you still feeling the same way? Are there any optimists left in Ukraine?
I'm sure there are optimists, but not about the situation with Trump and Putin. And actually, the conversation on the telephone between Trump and Putin sounded like conversation between two business partners and old friends who want to remove an obstacle in order to restore the relationship and the trade. And this obstacle is called Ukraine. So, I mean, there is not much ground for optimism if we talk about possible peace deal and actually negotiations which are conducted without participation of Europe and Ukraine. But again, the statements of European leaders, also President Macron, they give hope to Ukraine. And actually, I think sooner or later, Europe will be again playing major role in the destiny of Ukraine and in the solving of this conflict.
As a final question for you, what do you think a realistic peace agreement would look like then, given the situation as it is now, with the position from the White House, with the current indecisiveness from the European Union? By realistic, I mean something that both Russia and Ukraine are likely to accept in the long term.
It would be probably a temporary agreement about frozen of the front line and return of parts of Ukrainian land occupied by Russians, and postponing the decision on some other issues for later, for the time 10 years later or 5 years later. And then actually the process of long and painful negotiations would need to start. But first of all, of course, we need ceasefire and the beginning of the diplomatic process.
Andrey Kurkov, thank you so very much for all of your time and coming on the show today.
Thank you very much.